Yesterday, I came across a tweet, and I don't follow many tweets, but this tweet was referring to a video that was titled something like "Use your brain less to do more." And that was very interesting to me. So I clicked on the video, and the person speaking was Stephen Coulter, and I've never heard of this person before. And he is a researcher on flow. Now, what is flow? Flow just means being in the zone, being in the flow, being sort of one with one's own experience and losing oneself in the experience and losing sense of time. You probably know what I'm talking about. So as I listened to him talk, it was a short video, it was like 5 minutes, so I clicked on another video by him, which was his hour-long Google talk with his colleague Jamie Wheel. And so I watched the two videos, and I realized that if I was to replace the word flow with mania, we'd be talking about almost the same thing. And I'm not trying to glorify mania here. What I would like to point out are some of the parallels. And what's interesting to me is Stephen and Jamie are researching flow, as in how to get into the flow, and they're doing that mainly by looking at athletes who do extreme adventure sports like surfers, rock climbers, different things where a person can't really afford to not be in flow, to be an elite extreme adventure sports athlete of some kind. It basically implies being in the flow. And to me, these people will train along many times and over a long period of time to be able to really be good enough to be in the flow, to really be able to be one with what they're doing. And his research is also about how people that are able to be in flow through these extreme sports also are able to be maybe more intelligent in their daily lives because they've been in this flow. And he also Stephen talks about an experience, which this really caught my attention, where he was suffering from Lyme disease and had 5% functionality. Long story short, by going surfing, even though he could barely surf because he was so tired, and then he exhausted himself for 2 weeks, where he couldn't even move for 2 weeks because he went surfing. But then he did it again, and he kept doing this where he would go surfing for a short period of time because that's all he could do, but then be too tired, but then just go back and do it again. And he said by doing that over a period of, I think he said 6 months, he was able to go from 5% functionality to 80% functionality just by changing that one thing, which was surfing, which was allowing him to get into flow. Because I think he was a surfer before. Now, if he was never a surfer, I don't know if that would have worked, because he wouldn't have necessarily been in flow. Because he probably would have never gotten up on the board, for example. So what I'm realizing, what I felt was really interesting, was that by going into his flow state, he was able to heal. So in a way, flow is a healing mechanism. And if I'm to think of mania as a type of flow, a lot of times people that go into extreme states of consciousness have had some sort of trauma that needs healing. So he used surfing, which he was able to go into flow through surfing. which is a physical thing, to heal his physical ailment of Lyme's disease, or as one of the ways he did when other things weren't working. So for me, a person that maybe has traumatic psychological experiences, maybe as a response, the psyche goes into a state of mania, which is the psychological equivalent of, say, physical flow in surfing. Mania is like psychological surfing, and it's really riding a wave of extreme energy. And to me, it could be the psyche's way. And this isn't an original statement. These extreme states are seen as the psyche's way, or one of the ways the psyche attempts to heal itself. That's not new. But what might be kind of new is to really compare what this Stephen Coulter guy and Jamie Wheel have done in terms of researching the flow state, but especially Stephen's experience of surfing and going into his flow state and from that, he didn't do it in order to heal the Lyme disease, he just did it, and it happened to heal. So by being in his best peak physical self, he was able to heal the Lyme disease, not him, but his body. So in the same way, just it's more of a comparison, a simile, an analogy, that the psyche will go into this extreme state as an attempt, perhaps, to heal a lot of that turmoil that happened. And that can be personally, but I feel it also extrapolates to humanity in a way. So if we have a collective unconscious, it makes sense that certain beings go into these manic states in order to perhaps be a healing force or a healing mechanism in society. And that may or may not be true, but it almost makes sense that humans need to not just go into flow in sports, but also in daily existence in society. And I believe they're developing some different courses on this, because they have a little flow quiz, and it's about like a physical flow state, a social flow state, a contemplative flow state, and then something else. I can't remember, and I'm not trying to talk about it in order to actually be precise on what they're doing, because I've only looked into their stuff for a total of maybe 2 hours, and that's not enough to do justice to whatever they're doing. But what I wanted to talk about are the parallels to mania, because a lot of what he was talking about is very congruent with mania. And I feel like since he was able to go into flow physically and heal his physical ailments, mania as flow could be a way of the psyche's attempt to heal itself personally, as well as spreading that out to the collective conscious and unconsciousness. And unconscious, I really feel that a person in mania sort of pops up and their energy is immense. They have all this immense energy, and being in that state, as a person goes about their daily life, the energy is dissipated in their interactions until they're slowly, totally discharged from the extra energy that came up through them. And the energy that comes up through a person is often uninvited. And how does that happen? And I don't think it's a matter of figuring out how, per se, but the fact is that it does happen. Why does it happen? Will we ever really know why? Not really, but for me, it's fun to think about possibilities about why this happens. And speaking about mania in terms of flow is not in saying that's what it is exactly only. It's just saying it's one of the possibilities, it's one of the parallels. And even saying flow or mania, those are just words to describe something. It's a word to point to a certain state of being, but it's not the state of being itself. And more could be said about the state itself when a person is in the state itself. So if I was in mania next time, I could actually speak a lot about what it's like to be in the state of mania. But on the other side of mania is interesting to find parallels to it. And there were certain things that he talked about. He talked about how flow is autotelic, and that's a word I've never heard before. He described the word autotelic to describe being fulfilling within itself. So he's talking about flow. When you're in the flow, it's just fulfilling within itself. There's no really thinking about the whys and the hows. It's self-sustaining. I would think of that too as a positive feedback loop. It just sort of keeps feeding forward within itself. And mania is a lot like that too. It's a state that's very much in the present moment, a lot of it, in terms of a person just going about interacting with whatever is there and flowing with whatever's there right in front of the person. And that's a generalization. It's a bit more complicated than that. And so I would think that autotelic is also a characteristic of mania, as well as feeling very present, feeling timelessness. And they also talked about flow having a brain state of transient hypofrontality. And I'd never heard those words before either. And so my brain is just going, ooh, new words that talk about different states. But they first talked about transient hypofrontality. Whoever discovered it, I'm not sure, first discovered it in people with schizophrenia and people with addictions. And they're also saying that the transient hypofrontality is what is describing when the prefrontal cortex goes mostly offline. And that's what the first video was talking about, was use your brain less to do more. So it was talking about shut down your prefrontal cortex, or get to a state where it is shut down, because we can't shut it down. We can't just say, okay, prefrontal cortex, okay, stop talking, stop yammering on about stuff. And I've talked about the yammer voice before too. And I feel the yammer voice is really, it's the ego yammering on. It's the sense of me. It's the sense of me and my this, and I am this and I am that. It's really words, and those words divide us. So it makes sense that if it was to quiet down, then that area of the brain would be shut off. And he also talks about how that area, I think it was that area, is the seat of the inner critic going on, judging things in ourselves. So that all has to quiet down in order to get in the state of flow, which to me is also congruent with mania. So it makes sense to me that this transient hypofrontality was first discovered in schizophrenia and drug addictions, and probably bipolar disorder too. What I'm saying is that their research is on how to get in the state of flow, and they're doing the extreme athletes and stuff. And to me, my question would be, well, it's a different question, many different questions. And one is the question of psychiatry is how to keep people out of that state of flow, because they go into it and then they crash, and then they have all these bad experiences that are the opposite equivalent of the good experiences and get trapped in that inner realm of images and visions. But whatever. Basically, what's interesting to me is they're researching how to get in it, whereas psychiatrists like, how do you keep people out of it so they don't get lost? And maybe the trouble is that a person loses their sense of me and they don't get it back fully. So a person that goes into flow through surfing, they come back to the shore, they're their self, they can think and plan about how to get home and operate in society. Whereas a person that surfs the wave of mania or psychosis and is flowing with that, and it's even a flow in that there's no control really of the input that comes as a result of that state. So it is quite a flow state, and I would almost say it's an overflow state because there's way too much information at times. And that would be my question, is how does one in those states slow it down a little bit? And one of the ways is psychiatric medication. And that's why I say one of the reasons why I take medication is to keep me grounded in this reality that we all share at the same speed, because otherwise I would ride the wave of mania and psychosis, and that might just be a different flow of information or source of information or both than the consensus reality that we see through the aperture of the ego. So the aperture of ego gives us that sense of time that's absent in flow and mania and psychosis. It gives us all those senses of things that are constructs of society that aren't actually really real, but they're real in as much as that's how we relate to each other. So if we can't relate to each other based on those constructs, which aren't that real, the me isn't that real, but that's how we relate, then it becomes troublesome. So, yes, autotelic, transient, hypofrontality. And another interesting thing that Jamie Wheel brought up in one of the talks, I will listen to a few talks, but he talked critically about the self-help movement and basically said that instead of trying to do self-help, which is sort of the level of thought and the ego trying to help itself, which is the problem. So the prefrontal cortex trying to shut off the prefrontal cortex is basically what he's saying, which he's very right about. He says instead try to operate at an 11 and then see who's home. And that resonates with some of the stuff that I've been looking into in terms of mania and psychosis. And the direction I've been moving towards, and is something that is the reason why their talks struck me, because I may or may not have talked about in previous videos. I don't remember. That's a problem. I don't remember anything. Is the idea of embodying one's mania. And that just means, I won't go into it too much because I might have talked about it before. Basically, taking some of one's manic traits that they had in the manic state. So they were more like tied into the manic state, and taking those and then practicing them in daily life to make them traits that one can actually embody in daily life in the regular consciousness. And by doing that, it's almost like taking those bits that were good about the state and embodying them and practicing them in daily life so they're embedded in one's neurology, neuroplastically, in their neural networks, so then they're actually in the structure of the brain and the body through action. And by doing that, it almost makes the mania real in daily life without having to go back to that state in order to have those traits, because the traits are happening in daily reality. And I had that insight. And then Jamie Wheel actually has a video that says making your states into traits. And he's not talking about mania, but he's talking about the state of flow into traits. And I don't even know if I watched that video, but basically all the stuff they're saying was very congruent with what I was attempting to put into something as, I don't know what, maybe a workshop, maybe videos, or maybe just conversation about a different way to approach things, which goes along with operate at 11 and see who's home. So a lot of people who go through bipolar disorder like me are taught to manage symptoms, take medication, have safety plans and all this stuff that's based on fear. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I really think that's an important baseline to have those plans. I have those plans, but I wonder, how am I going to transcend the need for these plans? Or not that I never would need them, but I don't want to focus on those plans. Like, what am I going to do with my life? And so when I was thinking about, basically what I was thinking about is embody your mania. How can I embody my mania? What are my manic traits that I want to work on? And a lot of them I've kind of been working on over the years without even thinking about it this way. But instead of thinking I need to avoid XYZ symptom, I'm thinking I want to work on XYZ trait. So it's about moving towards the traits I want to embody. And a lot of people, and even myself at sometimes, tend to, and I'm not saying this is wrong, it's completely makes sense, tend to sort of pine for the manic times and the feelings and stuff. And then in the depression, it's there and it sucks. And it's about waiting and hoping for the mania, which usually just ends up in depression. So it's about sort of craving that feeling and the state when one can actually take those traits and think, how can I embody these traits? What activities can I do in my life to actually have the experience of some of these traits? Maybe it's very dulled down to a small limit, a small amount compared to having the experiencing a mania. But I feel that through practice and embodying these traits, consciously or subconsciously, or however one might want to design it into their life, one can actually move towards being that best self that one was in mania. So that's the thing for me. I felt like I was my best self. I was a self that I had never seen before, that I'd never been before, that I'd never experienced. And so I also feel that a person with, say, bipolar disorder like me, they have the up, and then I have psychosis, and then depression sometimes. But psychosis is the main thing. So if I go mania, psychosis, depression, the mania is further removed from the time that I'm intervened with in some way. So the interventions are usually based on depression or psychosis. And then the mania is forgotten about. And it's always seen as bad or pathological to the people that are intervening. And it is a dangerous state. I'm not by any means saying go and feel mania. If I wanted to feel mania, I could go off my medication, and then that would just produce a bad whatever, for now at least, until I transcend that. Or I could go and take some kind of drug, and then I would feel manic, but that is transient and it's not going to last. And so what makes it last? Not the state, but the traits. Because the state, who knows exactly why it happens, but it happens. And it's not really earned and embodied. It just sort of like, here you go, here's a gift of super energy, and you're going to feel superhuman. Play with it for a while. And then it doesn't last. So how can I work towards making that last? And it seems like what they're trying to do with this research is along those lines, but just not for mental health and not for mania. So I really feel like mania is a type of flow. I feel it's evolutionary. It's needed. If you imagine that there's a person in mania and they're in that high energy and they're dissipating all that energy in good ways to different people, it's like that charge that comes through a person is spread out, and then the person actually usually loses out. So I'm thinking now actually that a person that goes around in that consciousness of mania and then dissipates that energy actually is kind of a gift to humanity, because they're spreading it all out and then they take the hit for it, because it usually for most people goes into a depression, which is longer, or a psychosis or something, but it really does spread out some goodness. And then the person that goes through it is usually pathologized and seen as the bad guy in a way, like something's wrong with you, when really they'd probably just went out and spread a bunch of goodness and then had to experience a bunch of terrifyingness almost because they spread that goodness. And it's like they take on the terrifyingness and process it and dissipate the terrifyingness in a way. I think the whole state of mania and psychosis is something beyond the personal. It's not a personal thing, and it shouldn't be taken as this is what's wrong with the person. I think personally that's wrong. And I don't think, and I don't know if it matters if any of this is ever really proven. It's just conversation that friends might have, not really trying to prove anything, just from experience. And another thing that was interesting to me that Jamie said was about how he was alluding to, and I'm sure he elaborates on this somewhere, he must, that a person in flow can get as much done in one day as somebody in regular consciousness. And he called it steady state individuals. So he said a flow person can do 5 times more, 4 times more than their steady state peers. And I thought that was a cool way to say a person that's just in regular consciousness. It almost makes it seem like the steady state is undesirable. And a person like me who experiences mania and psychosis, I'm not a steady state person, that's for sure. So it's almost like I'm just not a steady state person. Some people are steady state, and that is kind of boring in a way. And some people can go into flow through physical stuff. I go into flow through mental stuff, and it's called mania. And so it was interesting, and I actually think I talked about this in a previous video, that how people that are diagnosed with a mental illness often don't fit back into the structure of society. And it's not because they're useless or lazy. It's because they just don't fit into the 9-to-5, 40-hour-a-week society. And maybe if somebody was tasked with a project and said, please do this, general outline, you have a month. And that would be assumed it would take whatever amount of hours. And the person would be able to get it done on their own time within that month. And they would probably produce something really, really good. But if you ask the person to come in every day 9 to 5, they're not going to be able to function. They'll be too tired. They'll be in different states of consciousness at different times. They're not in a steady state all the time, so they can't just say, they can't even apply for a 9 to 5 job because they just wouldn't be able to do it. They don't have the energy, or if they do, they have it at inappropriate times. So it was really interesting that Jamie Wheeler said that we need to move from a billable hours way of doing business to value creation. And that was basically what I was saying, that a person with non-steady states of consciousness would be able to produce that value that was asked for if it was given to them to do in a certain period of time, or just, here, do this is what we need, when you're done you'll get paid, or whatever it is. And the thing is that the person, it might be assumed that it would take the person 40 hours, and it might even just take them 10, because the person would probably complete it when they're in that flow state. So that was really interesting to me. And I think, because part of me feels like people that go through these different states of consciousness, these non-steady state individuals, are very gifted, and they have a lot of insight, and they have a lot of ideas and innovation, and they see things differently. That's actually part of the problem, is we see things differently, so it's difficult to operate in society. We almost see too much. We see too much. It's information overload. But if you or somebody was to give a person like that a project to do, or even a group of people that are these non-steady state individuals, they'd probably be able to produce something pretty good, because from my experience, we can see patterns, we can see relationships, and that's part of the information overload, is that if a person sees this one little bit of information, it's associated to so many other bits, and then that goes on and on and on until the person is basically squashed by information overload. And the thing is that a lot of us feel like we do have something to share or give, but we don't know how to give it, because it's not structured into society that we can give it. So if I was somebody researching like Stephen Coulter and Jamie Wheel, I would design a system where people can funnel ideas through when they're in these flow states of consciousness, and be reimbursed or given some kind of value in return for if some of it's valuable. So not all of it would be valuable, some of it would be repeated, but if there was a way to actually compensate people for some of their innovative ideas, then that might create a different way of doing business. There's got to be a way to do business with visionaries. There's got to be a way to do business with those people that go into extreme states of consciousness and can't always work in the routine of society. All that routine and all that structure and scheduling, that's all just a habit. And, you know, it might be on the way out. It's more of a decorated prison of sorts. So I really just thought that was interesting that he said that. And I'm sure other people have thought of that too. And it's not new, because people do contracts, people work in different ways that aren't always billable hours. But what I'm interested in is a way to get some people that have things to share that don't have a way to share them because they're not in workplaces and things, to be able to create value and, you know, be compensated or just be fulfilled in being able to create that value. And so it's interesting that in reference to flow, they think that there should be pay based on value creation versus billable hours. I feel the same way about people that go into mania in different states of consciousness. And that was part of the embodied mania thing too, is harvesting one's mania. So looking back and harvesting mania for the seeds. and then planting them in one's regular daily life. I feel too that maybe one day people will actually consciously harvest their mania in a more conscious way, even though it's a scattered state. But I feel like at some point people will be able to start to master it more so and really harvest it, and not just be in it for the feelings and the sensations and feeling like, wow, I'm so high, I feel so great. Well, how can I bring that greatness into daily reality? And it, of course, keeping oneself safe when they're in that state too. I feel the more that's harvested and pulled out of mania, and the more people that are able to embody their mania, are the less that mania will have to come up in individuals, because we'll have gotten the message. And I think with the people that are extreme adventure athletes that are in flow in that state, I feel like the researchers are trying to make it so they can be in flow in their daily life, or maybe they are in flow more so in their daily life than people that aren't these extreme adventure sport athletes. Well, the same can go for mania. If mania is sort of a flow state, can one bring some of those elements into one's daily life to be more flowy in daily life, instead of just following into the cycle of depression and then not taking anything of value from the mania? I feel like if something's taken and practiced, then maybe the depression won't happen so much. I also had a thought that it seems that there is an evolutionary force that's trying to shut down the prefrontal cortex. So mania, addictions, schizophrenia, probably various mental illnesses shut down the prefrontal cortex, which is the me, the linear thinking, the sense of separation. And then there's a lot of movement consciously to shut it down through mindfulness, through meditation, through yoga, through so many things that people are doing on a daily basis to shut it down. And in terms of the flow state that shuts it down. So flow is so great. Like, why do we need this prefrontal cortex at all? Where do we get it from? One of my questions is, why do we condition kids out of their flow? Because I feel they're in flow when they're born to a certain point, when they go to school and they learn the rules and they learn this and they learn the judgments and they learn how to measure themselves against and compare. And then here goes the yammering voice, yada 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 yada. Why do we give children that voice at all? And then we create all this hoopla and self-help, and even this research about flow. Be like, wow, it's so amazing. Like, flow, right? Flow. We got to be in flow. Well, we were in flow when we were kids. So why do we keep giving our kids this shit? Why are we allowing them to inherit this? Why do we keep going on with this? And then, interestingly enough, I don't know much about the neuroanatomy or neurophysiology or neuroelectricity or neurobiology of autism, but I'm guessing that there's something askew with the prefrontal cortex, which is the me, which is the thinking, which is the reasoning, which is the rationality, which is the judgment, which is the words, which is the language. Why are such a large percentage of children acquiring, or whatever happens, course, there's lots of debate about why there's so many children that are autistic or on the spectrum. They're not picking up language. I feel that language is actually the problem. We're talking about, oh, genetics of this and genetics of that. I mentioned in another video, it's really the memes. It's the memetics. It's the words. We're poisoning each other with our words. And now there's a generation of children being born, or it's been going on for a while, and I think it'll only get worse, that are not able to pick up the language in the same way. Something that, 20 years ago was taken for granted, that a child would just pick up language. Now all of a sudden there's a whole profession and so many people trained on how to intervene to shove language down these children's throats who can't acquire it. And we never question the words themselves. We never question what it is we're trying to force them to acquire. And I feel like the prefrontal cortex is on its way out through people going through these spontaneous crises and transformations and not being steady state, and so many people meditating. There's so many people trying to get rid of the very thing that we're trying to impress upon these autistic children. And I'm not trying to say don't teach them language. It's just very sad and interesting to me that I feel autism is evolutionary as well, just like mental health and mania, and this energy coming up through people in mania. And in another video I talked about the spontaneous social behaviors that will stave off extinction. And I feel a lot of those are expressed through someone in mania with their hyper altruism and sort of dissipated out to the multitude, and then the person crashes. And instead of seeing them as sort of a hero, a temporary hero in a way, they're seen as ill. And one day that'll change. And it is different in different cultures. Like the shamanic tradition, a person is actually seen and supported to cultivate their visionary abilities and to be a healer, because they're recognized as, this person is a healer. Look what they're already doing. Now let's support them to work towards integrating that so they can be that way on a daily basis. Embodied mania, hello, which is just another word. And I actually created a word. I called it shamania, because I actually feel shamanism is shamanism. I don't really know. Tomato, I don't know the right way to say it. I actually like shamanism better, but I've heard a lot of people that are shamans say shaman. So I created a little word. It's called shamania, just sort of uniting the two views of shamanism and mania. Not that they're completely congruent, but just to show parallels, that if I was to create something around embodying one's mania, I might call it shamania, even though I know nothing about shamanism. But anyways, back to the autism. My niece has autism, and she is a genius. Like, what I also feel is that it proves in a way that intelligence has nothing whatsoever to do with language and thought. She's very intelligent. She doesn't have that much language. She's getting there. She has enough to communicate with us. But she can use an iPhone and an iPad and play Nintendo and Wii like nobody's business. And she's like 3 years old when she was able to do that. I don't know what she is now, like 4? And she's so athletic, she's so energetic, she's just brilliant. And all the whatever she can do almost anything without language that we do with our language. So another part of the autism thing to me, and I empathize with it because I have a niece, but I don't empathize at the same time because there's nothing wrong with her. She's a freaking genius. And again, it just shows you don't need thought. So many, there is action without thought. And this relates to J. Krishnamurti, who I may have mentioned, but I've read a lot of his stuff, and he talks about action without thought. And to me, autistic children are showing you don't need thought in terms of words for action. So many times we think we need to be thinking, okay, I gotta type on my computer in order for us to go and type on our computer. That is not true. But the trouble is that we're always yammering on, that we think that the yammering actually relates to what we're doing. And then it's different if it's something like driving, where we can drive, yammer on in our heads, and then not actually know how we got home. And we think that's cool for some reason. But there is also a state where one can be driving, paying attention to what's going on, because it's actually quite beautiful and interesting out there, and not be thinking anything. And there's no thought required to drive, whether you're thinking about something else and driving through habit, or actually driving, being embodied and driving your car, which is equivalent to practicing the power of now, which Eckhart Tolle talks about. He talks about when you're washing your hands, pay attention to the sensation, be aware and present and not thinking about something else when you're washing your hands. And that's again just shutting down the me, the prefrontal cortex. That's practicing shutting that down. And in that way, I feel like we could be in more flow in daily life just by using the brain less in terms of this linear yammering thinking. And the benefit of shutting that off, they say, well, it uses less of the brain. And that's the thing. They talk about, oh, it's so interesting that we use yet less of our brain, yet we have more capacity, we're more creative when we're in that state of flow, and we're not really thinking, we're just in the moment, and if we're thinking, it's regarding to our creativity. Well, that's the thing. When we shut off this inner critic and everything, it allows, I feel, more energy to be channeled through. So I don't think of the brain necessarily as, the more patterns going on, the more it's doing. This is just noise. This is just actually interference. So the brain's a big channel and is trying to channel energy, which is the equivalent of flow. And the brain's going, while it's all getting scattered, and all this creative energy is just getting, you might have a creative, energetic thing come through a little bit, but then it's like, well, yesterday this and tomorrow that and blah, blah, blah. And it's just going on and on and on. And it's actually blocking the clear channel. So I don't necessarily think I don't really agree with what they're saying, and maybe they're saying the same thing when they're saying that the brain's doing less and you can do more. This yammering on is just habit. It's just words. It's just actually interfering with the clear flow of the channel that would come through if we weren't thinking. Again, how they say we think 60,000 thoughts a day, most of them are the same as yesterday. If we weren't doing that, then something new would be coming through. We just assume we have to be doing that. But it's just a habit. And then, like Jamie Wheeler said, if he said, I don't know what he said, I lost my thought there. So there's something definitely to do with the autism thing. And again, the evolutionary movement to shut down the prefrontal cortex. And it seems that if we don't stop giving it to our children and forcing it, then children will be born where we just can't even program them to the same extent. And one day there'll be a lot of them that are adults, and they're going to have something to say. They might not have the same vocabulary, but they have a very rich experience and subjectivity, and they perceive the world in a different way. They see it with different eyes because they don't see it through all these words that we see it through. And they're going to be telling us something different. They might even revolt against us because they've already revolted against words. And what are we? We're just a bunch of words. We think we're a bunch of words because we think. So part of the embodied mania thing is transforming mental health challenges into human potential. So the human potential movement is also interesting. And I feel that mental health crisis can be used as a transformative force. It is a transformative force, and it's not being supported to be a transformative force. It's ending up in places it's not supposed to go. It could be a different world if people are seen as visionaries with potential, who see possibilities, who can be invited to share some of those in a way where they're sharing and then perhaps compensated in some way for the value that they're delivering. So I really feel like it can move towards human potential. And another term I came across recently, well, I think I already mentioned it, is morphogenetic. And I don't think that's a word that Stephen and Jamie talked about. But I wanted to, in the spirit of relanguaging, because a lot of this revisioning is actually relanguaging, especially since most people see the world through the language they use. And in a way, the visions need to be translated into language. And I'm not talking visions like, oh, woo, whatever. Just what we see, what we feel, what we experience. Right now, the language is one of pathology. And it would be interesting to create more context and more language used to describe these things, so then people can see and experience them differently and maybe choose a different paradigm. And it doesn't have to be an exclusion to mental illness or diagnosis, but there's a big importance in making meaning out of the experience, whether it's an illness or not, especially because it's an illness maybe. So the term morphogenetic, I think it could be morpho-memetic. Genetic sounds like genes. I don't know if that's supposed to be genetic as in like generate. I'm not sure where that term comes from. Well, I know Rupert Sheldrake was the one to coin it. And I do like the idea of the morphogenetic field. But I feel it could also be somewhat a morphomemetic field. If there's all these memes and the memes are competing for brain space in all these different brains in human beings, there is a memetic field, and it seems that there's a certain number of memes that are infecting our brains that I think are very detrimental. So I'd like to invite conversation to change and contribute to the morphomemetic field. And I think that mania is an attempt to change the morphomemetic field with the spontaneous social behaviors. And it's interesting because in mania, when I experience spontaneous social behaviors, a lot of people respond in kind, consciously or subconsciously. So it does create that little mark on their brains and their experience and their own holographic structure. It repatterns. I feel like mania is the energy of a pattern that repatterns reality through these spontaneous social behaviors. And it keeps popping up in different places, and people often act very similar in those energetic states. So that says something, that there's got to be some kind of reason or force or purpose around it. And also maybe one day with all these people popping up and then people responding in kind to a certain level, not the same energy. Eventually one day people respond more and more, and that'll get passed on, and it will change the fabric of reality until one day people that pop up into mania are probably just normal. That's just how most people are most of the time. Happy, playful, going back to being childlike. And you think of being childlike, and then you think of the biblical references, be as a child or something. I don't know. I don't know much about the Bible. Though when I'm in those altered states, I feel I know a lot about that stuff. So again, with mania and the energy coming up through the person, it's like a person gets charged like a capacitor. And then they're going around and discharging little bits as they interact with different people. And that energy gets spread out and dissipated over time. So it's like being a capacitor. Actually, now that I think about it, if a person practices some of those manic traits that they experience in those high energy states, and then they practice them in daily life, when that energy comes again, the capacitor will stay charged longer because it'll actually be embedded in the neurobiology of the person. And maybe they'll get dissipated less, and then a person will be less affected by this dissipating charge and go down slower or go down less. It won't be such an extreme and such a fast dissipation of the energy. So I feel that could build up capacitance. And so that's another important thing. And not only that, that makes sense too. If a person's embodying their mania in daily life and the energy comes, it won't really be such a big difference because they'll already be working towards being like that state, that brain state, as brain traits. So it won't be that different. So it won't be such like an up and down. And also the energy might be able to stay, or if the energy doesn't come again like that to an extreme, as the person practices and practices and practices, it gives the chance for the energy to come in and sort of fill that practice space. So a person is able to go to a higher energy level in daily life by practicing, even though maybe that energy never comes back to a certain extreme. Though it may, but then again, it just won't feel like such an extreme because it was practice. So it could even be that mania or those states of consciousness are inviting us to level up because, hey, this energy is coming, so we better be able to embody it, or it's going to make us nuts. Because if it is too much of a change, it is like, whoa, I was this and now I'm in the depths of despair. And that's really difficult to go from one extreme to the other, because then the other extreme feels that much worse because we were just at the high extreme. So not only does it feel like this is the worst thing ever, it feels like what just happened to how great it was just a few days ago. So it's there's a lot to that. It's really interesting. And that's why I feel like embodying mania, or you could think finding your flow, if you want to take those other terms. Maybe it's as simple as finding how one flows, instead of thinking, well, I got to practice these traits. Just instead of thinking in terms of traits, think in terms of the flow or the activities. So say I get into flow when I'm reading and writing and thinking or watching YouTube videos, do that more, and then I'm in that, I'm probably going to be practicing those traits. And part of me making these videos for myself is like practicing the traits, because part of me wants to be able to have a conversation about this stuff, and instead of waiting till I find somebody to have a conversation with, just having a conversation with myself and what I'm finding. And I guess it's true when I write sometimes too. So if I have a thought or an idea and I put it down in writing, then something else comes to me and I write it down and then build on that. It's not like I had the entire thing before I started. And I'm finding the same thing with making these videos for myself. Some of the stuff, when I start talking about it, I think of another thought, idea. It comes to me. And I'm not saying that these are like true or anything, but there are ways to think of it differently or see it differently in a way. It's not really ways to think about it differently, because I don't know, it's not really something you think about. The things I'm talking about is that you kind of see it or you don't see it. If you don't see it, it doesn't matter. And if you've never been in these extreme states, if you're a steady state person, you probably won't see it. But maybe you will. I shouldn't say shouldn't either. Oh, words are getting the best of me right now. So I feel like perhaps one day, maybe when a person is able to practice embodying mania to a certain extent and kind of be in that zone, that it'll be a self-fulfilling state where one is just in sort of a flow state that's not as extreme as the high ecstasy of mania for the most part, but is like very much grounded and in the state of love and joy and all those grounded, balanced states of being. You know, I guess maybe some of it is just creating a balanced state between being active and having those spontaneous social behaviors, and maybe part of it is just to pass along some of those spontaneous social behaviors, and it doesn't require that everybody go into mania. And that's one of my things too, is by practicing the traits, maybe they'll be mirrored by other people. So manic traits could be passed on to other people through gestures. So we think of so much of sharing information, of like thinking and words and thoughts. But information is also action and gesture. And I was doing some research on that, and how something like a kind act, if somebody sees it, they'll be way more likely to be kind to someone else in the next 2 hours. I don't know, 2 to 4 hours or something. So that's what I mean by gestures. So manic traits, say I was super generous and kind and friendly, well, maybe I can't be like that to the same extreme every moment of every day, but I could be that 2% more, and then from that 2% more build on to 2% more and 2% more until maybe I'm like 50% like that. And being 50% more like that in daily reality passes on in gestures and in things people see throughout the day that change their behavior, that isn't about, hey, you need to change this. And I guess that's part of the self-help, is like, you should do this and you should do that and you should change this, which is a bunch of words telling you what to do. Well, you got to put in your prefrontal cortex and practice and blah blah blah. So I think that's the great thing about the mania, is that a person, it's not words, it's like, I was this embodied for a short period of time in mania. Now, how can I practice that in movement, in action, in gesture, in the things that I say on a daily basis, to again operate at that 11 that Jamie Wheel said, operate at 11 and see what's present, versus using the level of thought, the self-help. So the daily action, again, goes with embodying one's mania. So harvesting the mania and the traits to embody it in daily life, and say being 50% manic, but not in the state, not unbalanced, but manic in terms of the traits and the way one was. And that's usually what feels the best anyway, is how nice it was to be the way that we were in that state. It feels great in the state, but if we can be that way that we were, we're probably going to feel pretty darn good on a daily basis. So moving towards that, and then, yeah, I'm seeing that changing through just daily action, and I did research like random acts of kindness and things, and people in mania are very randomly kind. And these are the spontaneous social behaviors that Buckminster Fuller, I feel, was talking about, and the things that need to be solved beyond the level of thought, and thought is the level that created problems. Seeing beyond problems and seeing that life's not all about problems. When we're in mania, life's not about problems. It's about being playful, being loving, being caring. And I'm generalizing here. Yes, some people in those states get rather angry. And in my feeling, it's oftentimes due to injustice, and not necessarily personal injustice, but things that are just not okay. And I think I've talked about that a bit before. So that's also why I'm making videos. I just wanted to translate some of what I've thought and explored or pondered into video. And like I said, we're sort of visionaries. We can sort of see things, we can see feelings, we can see patterns, and we can see like images, or we can see how certain things extrapolate back into the past and maybe where it came from and was created, and we can see extrapolations into the future. So in that way we can kind of foresee the future. Doesn't mean that's the way it's going to happen, but we can kind of see the pattern beyond the actual thing that's happening now, and extrapolate it and associate it, and we can see, like, it can be scary sometimes. So it's not really like anything too unbelievable that people can sense these things. It's pattern recognition. And I feel, well, they talked about in the flow state how we can recognize patterns more, and that's part of being in flow. It again goes with mania and altered states of consciousness. We can recognize patterns, and in that way we see patterns, we see visions, or we see images, and then we sense what that means, and then that whole meaning gets translated from that image and from that feeling and from that impression into sound, into words. And the words that come from that that come from the pattern recognition, they have a different intensity. They have a different weight than the recombined associations from one's personal memory banks, which are just mainly conditioning. They don't have a very large value. So there's a difference between thought that's going on in the prefrontal cortex and repetitive, and the thought that comes from insight, which is the seeing of the pattern, of the whole, of whatever it is that one is seeing. And that's part of the flow state too. And that's how a person can have sort of like real intuition and felt senses of things. It's just sort of the brain calculating beyond the linear thought pattern, which is just very linear, logical reason. We think that that is where it's at, but it's really where it was. It's old. It's not seeing anything new. And that's why people can really read body language and really read into things when they have altered states of consciousness, is because they can read the patterns of the body and the facial expression and everything and one's energy. And that's why a lot of people that are in these mental health crises don't respond well to so many of the people that are employed to help, because those helpers, many of them aren't there for the right reasons. Many of them are. And then there's lots that are there with good intentions in their heart, but their energy is not in the right place, or the way they're approaching people or receiving people that need help. People really need to be listened to, but there's not really time for that. So that's why diagnosis is a convenient way to not listen to people. It's like writing them off. So yeah, mania could be some kind of high performance. And it's like stepping into the high performance vehicle version of yourself. Like yesterday, I was a Toyota Corolla, and now I am a I don't know, I'm trying to think of a high performance car.